Wow, well, thank you. So a few nights ago, we woke up to snow. And there was something about waking up to spring this morning a little bit, and I thought, so now what does the day look like? And you know, all the meetings and the classes and the students, and then I end up here, and I have to say this feels like springtime. This really feels like springtime to me. So I thank you so much for this amazing invitation to this place. Yeah, this place. So thank you. It's really a privilege. The Elective Supper Club, Study Supper, I was like, where is this place? Where am I going when I left campus walking here? It's like a supper club somewhere in the West Loop. I've never been here. Of course, I knew the Illinois Humanities Council because of the amazing work they'd done, but to bring all of you together really felt like it was one of those moments of like fresh air. Yeah, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm particularly happy to be here. You know, I'm a social scientist, so don't let all of these papers scare you. This looks like a social science thing. I know there's dinner coming. No, don't worry. This is about being my age where the type has to be big to remind me of what I want to say. But I really am excited to be among artists because as a social scientist who spends a lot of time writing to try to convince people of things, I'm very aware that there's limitations to what people are going to read to motivate them to act. I clearly know that what you do, which is present to people something in front of them that would motivate them to act, is a clear part of what we need to do in our work for justice. So I appreciate you so much. Your art, your vision, your leadership, your craft, your care to detail about presenting things, you know, makes me feel like I'm in good company. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you, Jane. Jane is amazing at like making sure all of this happens. Thank you to Steph, who like made the magic of the power. I mean, if we can't see anything else, at least we've got the first slide up, so I'm feeling good. Chef Lamar, thank you for providing us with the things to keep us going after this, the sustenance. And I know Angel had to leave, but really his leadership is kind of all over this, the footprint of that. And I also want to take a special moment to welcome and introduce you to my good friend, colleague, ally, sister, Scheherazade. This is Scheherazade Tillett, right here. And one of the things you get to do when you're invited to give this lecture, won't be a lecture despite all the papers, is you get to invite a guest and someone who knows the work that you do, who you feel like, you know, can sit at a table and continue on the discussion. And I immediately thought about my dear friend Scheherazade, and then I remembered she's an artist. So what a perfect friend, artist, co-activist. She should talk to you when you sit down about A Long Walk Home and her work with girls, black girls in particular, around sexual violence. I mean, this is someone on the ground making change every day. In fact, kind of came here a little late because she was on the ground making change tonight with young girls around these issues. So thank you, Sherry, for coming as my guest. I appreciate you so much. So, you know, all of that's all this like feel-good stuff and how happy I am to be here. But I have to say, I also looked around at these empty tables and a few chairs, and I thought, you know, we're not very far from the juvenile detention facility. We're not far from the Cook County Jail. Many of us have people that we love in those spaces, and how much I miss this place being filled up with all of our loved ones who are gone. And they're gone for lots of reasons, because they're caught up in the prison nation. They're gone because the world isn't ready for their brilliance yet, and so the only place for them is in a jail cell. Or they're gone because they're dead. They're gone because they're dead. One of the reasons that my heart feels heavy, you know, we're all contradictory, right? We feel like elated and heavy, is because I want to tell you about a woman I know, Ramona, who, you know, she was one of those people, kind of a friend, someone who I knew well for a number of years. And we buried Ramona 10 days ago. We buried her after she spent 20 years in federal prison. She was in federal prison because she tried to defend herself. She wasn't really successful because she ended up in prison. Tried to defend herself against years of abuse. She was released 2 years ago. She was given clemency 2 years ago. And when she got out, as well as when she was in, she occupied this space of an insider-outsider prison activist, abolitionist. She talked with us and taught us about structural violence. She talked with us about what it meant to have been abused by her husband for over 30 years before she was arrested, before she felt like she had no other option but to defend herself with a gun. She tried to reach out to the police to get some help, but because of who she was, a poor black woman in a poor black neighborhood, no one responded. She, once inside, experienced horrific abuse from the officers in, so-called officers in the prison that she was in. She was one of the people who was part of the test case for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Why? Because she had been raped in prison so often. But she also developed a number of health problems once inside, stress-related health problems. Now, some of them probably were caused by the abuse that she experienced from her partner. She had limited eyesight. She had chronic pain in her left arm. She often was triggered by loud noises, and she often displayed sort of mental health consequences of her abuse. And she was diabetic and had an eating disorder. Bad combination for a person in prison. Bad combination anyway, but a person in prison anyway. And so she left prison 2 years ago with a series of health problems that were not treated inside. And she died once she was out. She was out, she was testifying on Capitol Hill. She was working in an intervention program, both with domestic violence survivors and sexual assault survivors. She was working to talk with people who made decisions about mass incarceration, about what that meant for women. She was trying to pass a kind of legislative initiative in the state that she lived in about how women should have access to issues of self-defense if they're battered, right? So she was doing all of this work and died in her sleep 2 years after her release. So on the one hand, it's amazing and wonderful to be here with all of you, and I look at every empty chair and I think of her. She and the hundreds of thousands of other women, black women, poor women, trans women, battered women who should be here among us. And so, indeed, this is an opportunity to think about justice, to think about connections among all of us, to think about the amazing work that's happening in Chicago and around the world, but it's also a moment to remember those who aren't here because they're either in a kind of civil death in one of Illinois or federal correctional facilities, or like Ramona, a quite literal death because she survived, or for a while, but really didn't survive, the intersection of gender violence and the buildup of a prison nation. So kind of in her name, we begin. So let's move to the next slide, please. I'm sorry I can't get this to work. You're all right? Okay, thank you. So in some ways, what I want to offer is what I call a cautionary tale about radical change. It's a cautionary tale because I stand here first as a black feminist, really worried about the problem of violence against women. I'm going to talk a lot about that. And as I do, I want to invite you as people who are black women, know black women, love black women, to take a break if you need it. That's kind of a trigger warning. There's a lot in here that's about horrific experiences of degradation, abuse, humiliation, death. But I also stand as someone who has learned that in my work to end violence against black women, I have stood near, in some ways too close to, people who have been invested in the buildup of a prison nation as a response to violence against women. Okay, so stay with this for a minute. We as anti-violence activists, I'm using the larger we here, feminist-based anti-violence activists who worry about domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment, etc., have found ourselves standing really very close to those people who are interested in increased arrest, new laws, more legislation, more police training to try to respond to that violence. And in part, the cautionary tale that I want to tell is what happens when we're not critically clear about a feminist analysis of violence that includes attention to anti-black racism in particular, and attention to the issues of sexuality that affect women, whether we are queer or not, trans people in particular in Chicago. What happens when we adapt the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? Who knows Audre Lorde, right? We adapt the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. That's the cautionary tale. Our next slide. All right, so my work, this is maybe a little bit too much here, but talks about racial identity, class identity, and sexuality, how that shapes our particular identity, and how that identity leaves us vulnerable to social processes. The social process that I think is the most dangerous to us is the process of criminalization. Criminalization is the way that the prison nation targets us, and how that targeting of us, because of our multiple complex identities, leaves us really in the path of the buildup of a prison nation. And then, once we understand that, what we need to do, using a black feminist analysis to dismantle a prison nation. That's what all these papers say. I'm going to try to bring it to us, right? That's what all these papers say. Those are the kind of guiding questions that I use for my work. And I've been doing this work for a long time, so you get to have 5 guiding questions, I guess, by now, right? Next slide. So I am a sociologist. I teach at UIC. I'm, as was introduced, head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. It's a kind of interesting place to be. Longer discussion about that, maybe, and who is studying criminology, law, and justice these days. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. I'm also a social worker. And so as a sociologist, I study macro trends, like the big numbers of people who are going in and out of those cages called the criminal justice system. But as a social worker, I care about the individual stories, the lives of people, what happened that they ended up in the pathway of those cages. I'm also an activist, and that's probably should have been at the top because I was an activist before I was a sociologist and a social worker. That's influenced who I am as an academic. But I put teacher up there because it is important that I do identify as someone who tries to get people to think about these things in different ways, change minds, change hearts. I teach at UIC, I teach at the Cook County Jail, and I teach at Stateville Correctional Facility. How many of you know Stateville? Yeah, so Stateville's a maximum security prison for men, and or people who the state identifies as men. And it's been interesting to me, as I should have put student up there, because as a teacher, I've really had to go to school for the last 5 years as a teacher at Stateville Prison. I have worked for almost 30 years with women in prison at different institutions around the country. But this is the first time I've had a sustained relationship with a facility that houses, cages men. In the classes that I teach, the titles of my course are something like Violence Against Black Women or Black Women in the Criminal Legal System. And I've had one white student, I think one Latinx student, but all of the other students have been black people who the state identifies as men. And it's been really interesting to me to teach them, I'm the teacher, so-called, I'm the teacher of them about violence against black women. And what it actually has turned into, again, we can talk about this more later, is I have been a student of what it means to be a black man serving probably multiple life sentences. I mean, the brothers there are there for the rest of their lives, most of them. You know, it's,
And they're locked up all day?
They're locked up all day. Yeah, they're locked up all day. This is where Illinois death row was, right? So they're in their cells for all but 1 hour a day, unless they're in a class that we teach, right? So we're the freedom. And what it means to teach black men about violence against black women, and I just sit there and learn about violence against black women from the experts, right? It has been an amazing moment for me. And it has completely changed how I understand this work, right? Completely changed it. And most of my work has focused on policing, surveillance, gender violence, state policy, and increasingly trying to think about how we intervene in the particular political moment of mobilizing around black lives. And for me, what's important in that, any of you who are also involved in anti-violence activism, it's both the black part and the life part, right? Because I think we sometimes use the term black lives without really realizing that lives means people have to live. People have to live to have their lives. And so I think a lot about black lives, yeah. So that's who I am. Have any of you remember this bridge called My Back? Okay, so this is going to be a little lesson, sorry about that, in black feminism. So there's a really important book called This Bridge Called My Back. It's edited by Cherie Moraga. And in This Bridge Called My Back, edited by Kitchen Table Press, a really important black feminist organization, publishing company. There are lots of stories about what it means to try to bridge racial justice work and gender justice work. 40 years ago, when I finished my master's degree in social work, before I went to PhD school to become a sociologist, really who I was an activist. I immersed myself in an organization in Harlem, in New York, where I was living at the time. I immersed myself in an organization where we were talking about the need for racial justice. This was like the mid-1980s. Some of you weren't even born, but there was really important things happening in the mid-1980s besides you being born. In the mid-1980s, we were looking at housing, at health care, at jobs, at the environment, getting people to register to vote. Notice nothing has changed that much. We're still looking at those same kind of things, but from a racial justice lens. And we were sort of dynamic and active and energetic, like day and night, trying to focus on racial injustice and the way that capitalism was destroying our communities. I was living and working in Harlem. And not too long into that work, I realized that there were women in the corners who were saying, and they were like, and then the racial justice agenda, but what about and then the racial justice agenda, right? There was all of this silencing of anything that had to do with gender or sexuality. Now, women were leaders in these organizations, but the issue of gender wasn't there. In fact, there were women who were battered by their partners who were the leaders of the organizations, stalked on their way home from the political meetings, raped at the conferences around racial justice, right? So the issue of gender wasn't part of the narrative of what racial justice could bring. And it wasn't just that women were invisible or not recognized as leaders, but there was a way that women were almost targeted because they were raising something that seemed to compromise a racial justice analysis. I was working in Harlem. And then I used to take the train in Manhattan. Any of you from New York? To take the train from Harlem downtown. It's actually downtown Brooklyn. And I was meeting with women, the growing group of women who were talking about violence against women, about rape, about harassment, about stalking, about childhood sexual abuse, and how important it was to raise those as political issues, not just personal issues, but political issues that were limiting women's opportunities for work, school, family, mental health, physical safety, ability, all those things. All white women. So I would talk about the issues of gender violence and the importance of that. And then I would take the train up to Harlem. And we talk about racial justice, and then I take the train back. That's why this bridge called My Back becomes important, right? That there were very few spaces at that time where there was attention to both the gender dimensions of racial justice work or the need for an analysis of racism in the work on ending violence against women. Next slide, please. No, oh, wait, sorry, go back. Now you're doing something I put some things up here about say her name. Say her name is important because in contemporary work, there's a movement, some of you have heard of, to say her name. When we're talking about police brutality, we have to say her name. It's not just black men who are hurt, killed, controlled by the police. That's why I put say her name. All of us are women, but some of us are brave. A very important intervention in the feminist movement that said, it's the title of a book, that said it's when women of color, especially black women, organize, it is important to understand intersectional analysis of what it means to face violence, both because we're black and because we're women, right? And if we're queer, you have to add something else. If we're disabled, we got to add something else, right? Intersectional analysis. Silence, when we don't pay attention to who is hurt, that will lead to not only more death, but a kind of invisible death. And sick and tired of being sick and tired, of course, most of you know, is from the Black Women's Health Project that said, we have been doing the work of riding that train on this bridge called My Back for too long. We've been doing the hard work in the anti-violence movement, and we've been doing the hard work in the anti-racial oppression work, and we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and therefore you need to say our name. Okay? Sorry. Next slide. All right. So, therefore, there were five questions. Now there are 5 frames. They're directly related to the questions, right? So, one, I want to talk about gender violence and how persistent it is. Then I want to talk about carceral feminism and how dangerous it is. Then I want to talk about criminalization, which is almost the logical extension of gender violence and carceral feminism. I'll talk a little bit about America's prison nation, which we are deeply invested in, and then talk about prison abolition as what we need to do therefore. Okay, frame 1, the persistence of the violence. This is what I was giving the trigger warning about. So we're grounding ourselves, trying to hold that almost 60% of black women will be raped, in our lifetime. Probably more if we counted the underreporting. that we will be physically assaulted and indeed killed at a much higher rate than our white or other women of color counterparts. That we'll be physically harassed, trafficked, that we'll find ourselves excluded from opportunities for education, etc. Black women are much more vulnerable to the problem of gender violence, very significantly. And yet, next slide, the attention to our experience of violence is ignored. Part of that is because we're poor. We are more likely to live in communities that are written off because of the violence in them. Because we have multiple health problems anyway, so we show up at emergency rooms because we don't have insurance anyway to go to a private doctor. We show up at emergency rooms and people can't really figure out exactly what's going on for us. We don't rely on the criminal legal system, do we? We don't call 911 to help us because 911 what? Hurts us, right? And yet we're over-policed anyway, so if we're hurt, we're likely to be arrested, not helped. And because our community, remember that community that I talked about in Harlem? Our community has not taken up this issue with any seriousness. So the first thing we need to settle on in our discussion is the persistent gender violence that Black women experience. Multiple forms of oppression, many perpetrators, over a lifetime, ignored and under-recognized. Part of why that's possible is the second frame, the buildup of a prison nation. So I use the notion of a prison nation in my work to talk about the convergence of policy and ideology. Policy meaning laws, regulations, decisions that people in elected office make, plus the kind of morals and values that lead to that. The fear that we have about dangerous people, and therefore the laws we pass about dangerousness. When we build up a prison nation, we take away resources from communities for mental health services, for educational services, for transportation, and instead funnel them into correctional, so-called correctional facilities, jails, prisons, locked treatment centers, etc. Part of what allows us to do that is what I call, not I, many of us call a neoliberal ideology that says, really the problem is you didn't get it right. You made bad decisions. You didn't move out of that neighborhood. It's a blame of individuals so that problems like being poor or not having enough resources to take care of your kids or going to a bad school, problems, social problems become crimes. Being pregnant when you didn't want to be becomes a crime. And we deploy aggressive law enforcement, put all of our money there, to sort of undertreat the social problems. So it's one of those moments where we say, we take these problems, instead of problems, we put them in the category of crimes. We treat them with law enforcement instead of social services. And we blame the people that are first problematic and now criminal, and we lock them out of our view. That's the buildup of a prison nation. And be clear, this is a set of policy decisions. We decided that standing outside of a school, if you've been arrested before, is a crime. We've decided that if you put the wrong information on your application for public assistance is a crime instead of a mistake, right? We've decided these are crimes. We could have made other decisions, right? That's what we decided. That's the buildup of a prison nation framework. In a quite literal sense, that means that there are 7 million people in this country who are under the control of the criminal legal system. This country, most of you know this, houses 25% of the world's prisoners. 25% of the world's prisoners live in the United States, well, live in cages in the United States, way out of proportion to our population. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, but it's not just a high rate. People serve longer sentences here than anywhere else, for less severe crimes than anywhere else, in worse conditions than almost anywhere else, farther from their communities than anywhere else. So we have a project, if you will, of a prison nation that says it's not just a high crime rate, but it's a mass movement of people from their communities to cages in areas that their families and communities can't ever have access to them. So if I said to you, what are the 5 highest rates, the 5 communities at the highest rate of HIV, foreclosure, food deserts, environmental inequality, school dropout, like we could name the 5 communities in Chicago, right? Those are the communities from which most incarcerated people are drawn from, taken from, snatched from. Here's the important thing. They're not the communities with the highest crime rates. They're not the highest crime rates. They have the highest concentration of disadvantage, overcrowding, poverty, low home ownership, concentration of disadvantage, highest arrest, but not highest crime. That's the project of a buildup of a prison nation that says we need those people from those communities to occupy these cages that we've built in rural, white communities where factories have divested, and instead we have now new jobs called what? Prisons, right? Okay. That's what mass incarceration is. But it's even more complicated, maybe worse than that. The mass incarceration problem of a prison nation is more than just the bodies in those cages. Now that would be enough. It's more than that. It's how we've migrated the ideology and the practice from the prisons to our communities. So there's some data that says for black women there's a decreased incarceration rate. And you know, when I initially read those studies, I was like, okay, this is really good news. And then I realized that maybe there aren't as many women in the cages. But if we look at schools, welfare offices, mental health treatment facilities, if we look at where people are confined by authority to not have the opportunity to determine for themselves what they need to do, we see that the migration of the ideology of a prison nation is no longer just inside the institution. So how many of you have been in a Chicago public school where there's a jail cell? You should, well, I should say you should go there. You know what I mean. In the school, you go to the principal's office. While you're waiting for the principal to see you, you're in a room with bars. I mean, quite literally, a room with bars. So that's a migration of a prison nation from the juvenile detention center to our schools. And then, by the way, of course, we've got the schools closing, right? So we've got the schools closing, and when the ones that are open have jail cells in them. When you cheat, using air quotes here, cheat on your welfare, it used to be that you would probably get like an administrative sanction, like you'd lose your benefits. Now, you'll catch a case. And while they're interviewing you about what you put down on your form, guess where you'll sit? In a room with 3 walls and what? Bars. Okay, the exportation of the buildup of a prison nation into community settings. When you don't have enough bedrooms for your kids, and you're under the supervision of Child Protective Services, and you said you did, why? Because you want to keep your kids, and someone comes to your home or your child reports, yeah, I share a bedroom with 2, 3, 4 other children, what happens? You not only get some kind of sanction, you're arrested, and guess what is appearing in the offices of Child Protective Services? A room that looks like a jail cell. So example after example, both the physical space, the kind of sanctions, what used to be an administrative sanction is now a felony. The school to prison pipeline, we've heard a lot about that, like you're asking a question too many times, that's acting out, or you're snatching a backpack. Any of you have kids, you know that's like a thing they do, is take each other's backpacks. Well, that's not theft, that's like taking your friend's backpack, right? Taking the Spanish homework out. All of the buildup of a prison nation is now exported, even as we're closing down prisons, maybe, we're building cells outside of those spaces. Okay, the metaphorical prison nation. All right, so we started with gender violence, now I'm on prison nation. Where are we? I'm trying to make the connection between the way that the attention to violence against women has led to, or at least been in cooperation with, the buildup of a prison nation. And this is a distinctively black story. That's why I bring black feminism here. Part of what has happened as we've tried to respond to the problem of rape, battering, harassment, stalking, the murder of women, is we've said we need more legal and legislative attention to the problem of violence against women. We've passed laws, we've trained police, we've set up specialized court, we've encouraged arrest. And at the same time, so we've done that on the one hand, in part of the buildup of a prison nation. On the other hand, we've said black women should somehow lean into or rely on the criminal legal system to solve the problem of violence against us, right? So it's been this conversion of prison nation and response to anti-violence activism. So at this point, you're all thinking, so okay, that's important, but like, how does that really look? What does it really matter? Let's go to the next slide, because it reminds me to tell you a little bit about the on-the-ground reality of what this looks like. I'm going to share with you three stories of women who are caught up between the buildup of a prison nation and the epidemic of gender violence toward black women. Now, their stories are very long stories. We'd be here all night. The food would be ready, be more than done. You'd have many other things to go to. I sort of humbly and in some ways with hesitation, give you only short versions of these very long stories because these are people's lives. But I want to kind of fill the room with some reality here. The first one I call, in my book, Arrested Justice, The Discovery. Tanya was 16 years old. She lived on the south side of Chicago. She went to Kenwood High School. She was arrested at her school one day after there were lots of police noise around the outside of her school because there had been a labor strike, some of you may remember this, where the trash was not being picked up from the south side of Chicago. This was about 8 years ago. Trash was not being picked up, and the news was there looking at how the trash was coming out of the trash dumpsters, and out of the trash dumpster they find a backpack, and in the backpack they find a baby. Tanya had delivered the baby in the bathroom of her high school, not knowing what to do, put the baby in the backpack in the trash in the dumpster, and the news media discovered this. The discovery. Tanya had been sexually abused by her uncle for years. under surveillance, under control of her boyfriend for 3 years, neglected by her teachers. They were from Teach from America. Didn't really have a sense of what was really going on with the young people in their school. There was no mental health services in her school. There was no pregnancy prevention program in her school. There were no advocates in her school. Her uncle, who lived in the household, was out on parole. So she felt like calling the police into that household was going to be a dangerous thing, even though she was being raped and stalked by her boyfriend and pregnant, didn't know who the father of the baby was, had no one to turn to. Her parents were distracted by trying to meet multiple economic needs of her family members. She ended up being arrested for the terrible crime of murder of her infant. That was terrible enough. The accounting of this, poor, black, irresponsible, sexually active, promiscuous even, adolescent who couldn't make good decisions for herself, on and on. The news media spun the story just as you imagine that it would, in all of the ways that brought forward this kind of hegemonic, negative image of poor, black, irresponsible adolescent girls. No advocacy group in Chicago around rape, around sexual abuse of children, around domestic violence, around the rights of families, and around teaching. No one intervened to assist her. Next slide. Not far from where Tanya lived was Stateville Gardens. Any of you know Stateville Gardens? Used to be, right? Some of you. Okay. Ms. B lived there. She lived there for over 30 years. Ms. B raised her children in Stateville Gardens. Stateville Gardens was identified by the city of Chicago as part of its plan for transformation. You know what that meant? Moving people out of public housing into and dispersing them into the outer suburbs of Chicago, near suburbs of Chicago, so that that land could be redeveloped for people who wanted to live close to downtown. Month after month, more and more people were removed from their Stateville Gardens apartment, but Ms. B stayed. She's one of the last residents there. For 3 months, she was harassed, targeted by Chicago Police Department, undercover unit, 5 white men. They sexually assaulted her. They invaded her apartment. One incident, they moved in the apartment, took her son and one of his friends to one of the outer bedrooms, kicked them, threw them on the floor, handcuffed them. They're laying on the floor. Ms. B's begging for their release. They take the young men out of the apartment. One of them had been on parole. They felt, therefore, they were entitled to the abuse that Ms. B was ordered to lay down in her bathroom in her apartment, her desolate apartment, the whole landscape of the community. There was nobody around but her and her family. Lay down on her apartment, take her clothes off, and in effect do an internal cavity search on herself while they watched. For her, it was reminiscent of the gang rape that she had experienced by the people who had worked as part of the demolition crew as part of the plan for transformation. She spent months trying to complain about them, trying to get advocacy from rape crisis centers, trying to get people who were in charge of her son and his friends' parole to try to intervene. No one helped. Next slide. In a whole nother city, around the same time, 4 black young lesbians were walking in the streets of Greenwich Village. And have you heard of the New Jersey 4? Yeah. So Greenwich Village is supposed to be a place where we can express our sexuality, right? As lesbians, we can be out and proud, right? They're walking down the street, a young man selling DVDs on a card table notices that they have physical attraction to each other. He starts to shout degrading, I won't tell you what they were, you can imagine, language at them. They keep walking. They're trying to ignore it. It's embarrassing. And he keeps going and going and going. And finally, he leaves selling his precious DVDs, crosses the street, and physically assaults one of them. She fights back. He assaults another one. A fight ensues. A white man intervenes to try to protect the 4 lesbians who are trying to defend themselves against this sexual assault. Someone stabs the person who's causing the harm initially. Reports are that it really was the white man who stabbed the black man who was selling the DVDs. But at any rate, the 4 black women are arrested. They go to court. The court setting is full of references to their sexuality, the lesbian wolf pack, their appearance, their non-normative names, the way that they appear. All 4 of them are sentenced, actually 7 of them, because they had 3 friends, 7 black lesbians serving time because they tried to defend themselves and they had no selves to defend, right, in that setting. No anti-violence organization helps them. New York City, people are looking at police brutality. No one comes to defend them. No gay and lesbian rights group comes to defend them. They're serving time. They're serving time in a New York State prison. Ms. B is under protection because she, tried to resist the police brutality that she faced. 5 undercover white police officers. None of them lost their jobs, by the way. She won a very small out-of-court settlement. They were all still working. And Tanya's sitting in a jail cell by herself because she had no other option, she felt, than to deliver the baby, put the baby in a backpack, and the baby in it. So we have those cases. Next slide. And we have probably hundreds of thousands of other black women just like them. Lana, woman I worked with who's arrested, she had her boyfriend's gun in her bag because after he battered her, he threw it in there, called the police, she came, and it was an unlicensed weapon in her bag. Yvette was arrested for child endangerment because her husband, who was supporting the children, was on the scene. Even though she had an order of protection, he wasn't supposed to be there because she was getting some money from him to take care of her kids who didn't have food for the next day. Tierica was arrested for filming the police, all black women, for filming the police after the police had sexually harassed her, propositioned her after she called them because she was battered by her boyfriend, and she filmed the police trying to talk her out of filing a charge. Next slide. So in some ways, what I'm trying to say about the cases is these aren't exceptions. This is happening as we speak to black women who are, on the one hand, experiencing extreme forms of gender violence and at the same time being targeted by the buildup of a prison nation. And the cause of this, I'll say, is carceral feminism. I'm going to go through these last points kind of quickly because I think they're kind of evident, right? So carceral feminism is the ways that we have said to people, particularly women, who are in danger, to rely on the criminal justice system to solve the problem of the danger that they're in, which is in some ways caused by, what? The criminal justice system, right? Dial 911. What? Why would 911 help me? But we've put it out there to women, and when they don't, especially in the case of black women, if you don't involve yourself in the buildup of a prison nation in response to your social, intimate, and political problem, which all 3 of those cases represented, then there's something wrong with you, not something wrong with the system, because guess what? Then you're arrested for being non-compliant with the criminal legal system. Carceral feminism says we have decided that we're going to solve the problem as if we're all white people who have racial privilege, and the system is going to work for us. And if you don't fall in that category, I don't mean like you're white, but you can act like you're white, then in fact you are deemed as a criminal yourself. It's why we have such a disproportionate number of black and brown women in the Cook County Jail today. Carceral feminism. Next slide. So, even though I've been talking about violence against black women, we could make the same argument about undocumented people, young people, disabled people, especially people with mental health issues, trans people. All of the people who are vulnerable are betrayed by and targeted by the criminal legal system, and these are the people who are in the most trouble because of the violence, especially the intimate partner violence coupled with the systemic violence. So we've created a system where those who need help the most are the most targeted by the system that's designed really to not help them. Next slide. So that's my black feminist reflection moment, right? And the reason I bring black feminism into this in particular is I think that the way out of this is to look at Ms. B, Tanya, the New Jersey Four. That is to focus on the people who are most vulnerable and say, if we could help them, then we could help people who are in places, in positions of less vulnerability. So these are the lessons, that racial justice work is completely inadequate unless we pay attention to gender justice. Amen there, right? Okay. That the oppression is interlocking. It's not just rape, it's rape and then the stigma of rape, and then it's the worry that black men are going to be prosecuted for rape more than white men, and then it's the worry about what happens to people once they're in prison. Like, that's how it works in real life, right? The interlocking oppression. We have to rely on the leadership of the people who are most affected, not the people who write policy from places like universities, where I work. And we have to support a complex analysis. Yes, next slide. So these are the framing concepts again, right? Gender violence is persistent. Carceral feminism, which says we have to rely on the criminal legal system, is not only inadequate, it's dangerous. That criminalization is what happens to people who experience violence, and it's because we have invested in this country in the buildup of a prison nation at the expense of supporting community efforts to create change, and that's why we need a politic of prison abolition, which is my last slide. Almost my last slide. Okay. So this is what prison abolition is, as a very basic point. We need to do something different. Shut it down, and build something else. And the build something else has to be a community. This is aspirational, by the way. This isn't like necessarily something we can do tomorrow. Prison abolition isn't just let all the people in prison out right now, but it's do something different right now for the people who aren't yet there. They're on their way, because we are building up this prison nation as we speak tonight. But what can we do now? How can we reinvest in communities, build coalitions with people who we haven't built coalitions with before? How do we bring together a feminist analysis and protect women, trans people who are the targets of violence, but at the same time not do it by relying on structural violence of a prison nation to build it? How do we invest in communities again? None of this is sort of like magic, but it's really practical work to say we will not participate. We will not participate in over-policing, in surveillance, in the remedy of putting people in cages for the rest of their lives. Instead, we will try to find ways in our neighborhoods, in our families, in our city, in our communities to keep people home. And when we do that, we have to do it knowing that we will have to protect those people who are most vulnerable. To me, that's the Black feminist analysis of prison abolition. And it's a series of questions. Maybe you can talk about this at your tables. It's a series of questions of how are we going to do that? And I would say to you, in particular, what's your role as artists in helping to do that, right? What's the way that you can present something to people that will motivate them to engage in a politic of prison abolition? And it cannot be a prison abolition that just says we have to let the people who are in prison out. We have to let the people who aren't yet in prison not go, and the people who are harmed, especially women, children, queer people, immigrants, etc. How do we keep those people safe? It can't be one without the other, right? So if we did that, when Tanya got pregnant, under terrible circumstances, when Tanya got pregnant, what would we do? We'd have some doulas, and we'd be there catching that baby. And we'd say, Tanya, okay, this was terrible. What do you need to help you raise the child you want to raise? How do we help your teachers respond to you in a more respectful way? How do we help the household that you live in that's complicated? Hurt by your uncle, abused by your boyfriend, there's somebody there with a criminal record who's dangerous and endangered at the same time. How do we help that work for you? Not just work for you, but how do we catch your baby and help you raise that baby? Who's on for that, right? How do we do that? That's about catching that baby. How do we say to Ms. B, okay, look, you have stayed. All those other people got dispersed. You're the last apartment in your building. Where do you want to live? What kind of community do you need? How is it an act of resistance to say, I'm not moving yet? Who are those demolition crews? Probably some of them are as disenfranchised as you are, given who works in construction in this city, right? How do we say, let's build it up, apartment by apartment by apartment? How do we create a community that was destroyed? Not the one that was disadvantaged and that was unsafe, but a better community for you in the same space that you want to be. How do we help you, Ms. B? And then we say to the New Jersey 4, finally, you are celebrating your love publicly, on the streets, in their faces, right? And that's beautiful. You're young Black lesbians, and we need your love. We don't not just want it, we need your love. And I'm right there with you, right? How do we say your love is the way to our future in some way? That's Black love, right? And don't we need Black love? And we would say, that's what we want. And how do we say, back off? I don't want him in prison either. Right? I don't, but I want something to happen differently for her. And how do we say, dude, you can't do that to her. She's our sister, and this is Greenwich Village. We're trying to keep this from developers who are trying to make this a white space in New York that's like a tourist attraction on gayness, right? How do we say, no, 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 we're going to be here, right? This is our space, right? That's a prison abolition politic. And I think art and artists have a lot to contribute to that project. I invite you to do that. I appreciate your attention to all of this, all those papers and all these slides, but I really invite you to try to think about what your role is in this project. Like those 3 cases, yes, but really moreover, the politic of prison abolition from a Black feminist perspective. So for that, I thank you. Yeah.